It was sometime in the early hours of a Thursday morning in the spring of 1973, and the hallway outside Studio B at Hitsville West smelled like cigarette smoke and old carpet. Sly Stone had been there since 11, not to record, not to meet anyone. He had come because he had nowhere else to be, which was something he would never have admitted out loud, and something that the two assistants who let him in through the back entrance understood without needing to be told. He walked through the building with the loose, proprietary ease of someone who had spent enough years at the top of something to treat other people's spaces as extensions of his own. Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked. That was still how it worked for Sly Stone in 1973, even if the edges of that authority had begun, very quietly, to soften. He had heard from someone, he would not remember later who, that Marvin was in the building, working late, alone. This was not unusual information. Marvin worked late often, and alone more often than anyone at the label was entirely comfortable with. But something about hearing it that particular night made Sly slow his pace through the corridor. He had been thinking about Marvin, which was also something he would not have admitted. Not thinking about him the way you think about a friend, or even a rival in the clean competitive sense. Thinking about him the way you think about a problem you cannot quite locate, something in your peripheral vision that disappears when you turn to look at it directly. Sly Stone and Marvin Gaye had never been close. They occupied the same industry, moved through the same circles, appeared at enough of the same events that a casual observer might have assumed a friendship existed. What existed instead was something more like a careful, mutual recognition. Two men who understood each other's value without ever fully understanding each other. Sly had watched Marvin's career the way you watch weather, not because you need to act on it, but because something in you tracks it instinctively, reads the pressure changes, notes the direction of the wind. What's Going On had come out 2 years earlier. Sly had listened to it once in his car, driving nowhere in particular through the hills above Los Angeles. He had not spoken about it to anyone afterward, not because he had nothing to say, because what he had to say was the kind of thing that, once said, could not be unsaid. And Sly Stone had enough instinct for self-preservation to know the difference between an observation and a wound. The door to Studio B was not fully closed. There was a line of light along the bottom, and through the gap came a sound that Sly almost did not recognize at first, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was so stripped of everything that usually surrounded it. No arrangement, no production, no layer of craft placed carefully over the feeling to make the feeling manageable. Just a voice and a piano, and the voice was doing something that Sly had not heard a voice do in a very long time. Maybe ever. It was not performing. It was not even singing, exactly, in the technical sense. It was closer to the sound a person makes when they believe with complete certainty that no one is listening. Sly stopped walking. He stood in the hallway with one hand against the wall and listened. And the thing he felt was not admiration, exactly. Admiration was too clean a word for it. What he felt was something closer to recognition, and recognition of the uncomfortable kind. The kind that shows you something about yourself by showing you something about someone else. The voice on the other side of that door was carrying a weight that Sly knew the shape of. He had been carrying a version of it himself for months, maybe longer. The specific weight of a person who has built something enormous and beautiful, and then found, standing inside it, that it does not protect you from anything. He did not open the door. He stood there for what felt like a long time, but was probably less than 3 minutes, listening to Marvin work through something on the piano. A chord progression that kept circling back to the same unresolved note, as if searching for a place to land and finding every option insufficient. The voice rose and fell around the chords. It was not a finished song. It was a man in a room, alone at 3 in the morning, trying to find the shape of something he could not yet name. Sly had come into that building feeling, as he had felt for some time, like a person moving through a familiar space that had begun to rearrange itself in ways he couldn't quite track. There's a riot going on had sold. The tours had happened. The awards had been collected and placed on surfaces in rooms he didn't spend much time in anymore. And yet something about the last 2 years had left him with the persistent, low-grade sensation of being slightly outside himself. Watching his own life from a distance, he could not seem to close. He had told himself this was the natural result of overwork. He had not told himself the possibility that the distance was not circumstantial, but structural, that something in the way he had built his life had made a certain kind of closeness to other people, to his own music, to the feeling he'd originally been chasing, increasingly difficult to access. The voice behind the door did not have that problem, or rather, it had all of those problems and was not attempting to solve them. It was simply inside them, fully without negotiation. Sly pushed himself off the wall and kept walking. He did not know at that moment whether the feeling settling into his chest was something he should pay attention to or something he should move away from as quickly as possible. He had always been faster at the second thing than the first. He left the building without speaking to anyone. The night air outside was cool and carried the particular flatness of a city that is neither fully asleep nor fully awake. He sat in his car for a while without starting it. The sound from the other side of that door was still in his ears. Not as a memory exactly, but as a physical presence. The unresolved note on the piano, the voice finding its way around a grief that could not be named, and therefore could not be finished. Sly Stone had known Marvin Gaye was talented. That had never been a question. What he had not expected, what he was not prepared for sitting in a dark parking lot at 3 in the morning, was the specific quality of what he had heard. Talent you could account for. Talent existed on a spectrum that could be measured, compared, located within a context that made it comprehensible. What Marvin was doing alone in that studio was something that resisted that kind of accounting. It was not a performance of pain. It was not pain shaped into something an audience could absorb safely. It was the thing itself, unmediated. And there was something about the unmediated thing that Sly found he could not look at directly without something in himself shifting in a way he wasn't sure he could reverse. He had spent years working from a principle that music should explode outward, that the energy in a room should be centrifugal, should expand and pull everything into its orbit. He had built his sound around that principle. The horns, the harmonies, the relentless forward momentum that made a Sly Stone record feel like something you were inside rather than something you were listening to. But sitting in the parking lot with the sound of Marvin's voice still settling in his chest, he understood something he had not let himself understand before. That you could go in the opposite direction, inward instead of outward, quieter instead of louder, and arrive somewhere the centrifugal approach could not reach, somewhere more exposed, more honest, more frightening. He did not want to think about what that meant for his own music. He started the car and drove. The weeks that followed were not, from the outside, visibly different from the weeks that preceded them. Sly kept working, kept moving through the obligations and engagements that structured his days. But something had shifted. A question had lodged itself somewhere in the back of his mind and would not leave. Not a question about Marvin exactly. A question that Marvin's voice had prompted, but that was, at its core, entirely about Sly himself. He had started around this time to listen to his own recordings differently, to hear in them something he had not previously registered. A kind of insistence he now recognized as a form of protection. The music was always moving, always building, always pointing forward. It never quite stopped. Never stayed in one place long enough to examine what was actually there. He had always thought of this as energy. He was beginning to wonder if it was also a way of avoiding the thing that Marvin was doing in that studio at 3 in the morning. The thing that required you to sit with the unresolved note until you understood what it was asking of you. Sly Stone was not a man who sat with things. He had built a life, a career, an identity around the refusal to sit with things. The idea of stopping, of being as still as that voice behind the door had been still, produced in him a discomfort he found difficult to locate and therefore difficult to address. He pushed it to the edges of his attention and kept working. Marvin would have recognized this, not because he had any particular insight into Sly's interior life, but because he had spent enough of his own years doing the same thing, using work as a way of creating the sensation of forward momentum when the real motion he needed to make was something quieter and more demanding. Marvin had learned slowly and at great cost that the quiet didn't go away when you outran it. It simply waited. It was patient in a way that energy and ambition were not. The two men saw each other a handful of times in the months after that night, at events in passing, in the brief shared spaces that the industry created and then dissolved before anything genuine could develop in them. They were cordial. They had always been cordial. If Sly noticed that something in his posture changed slightly when Marvin was in the room, a barely perceptible drawing inward, a quality of attention he didn't direct at other people in the same way, he did not examine this too closely. It was safer, he had found, to let certain things remain peripheral. Marvin, for his part, was moving through his own version of the same slow dissolution. The marriage to Anna was over in everything but legal documentation. The relationship with Motown was strained past the point of recovery. The music was still there. The music was always still there, which was both the thing that kept him going and the thing that made the rest of his life harder to inhabit, because the music made visible the distance between what he was capable of feeling and what his daily existence actually offered him. He was recording in pieces, at odd hours, following the threads of feeling wherever they led, regardless of whether they led anywhere commercially viable. This was, in its way, a form of freedom. It was also a form of isolation. The two things were not separable, and Marvin had long since stopped trying to separate them. The recording that Sly had heard through the door that night was never released in the form it existed then. It became something else eventually, folded into sessions that would produce music that reached the world in the appropriate shape, structured, produced, delivered in a form audiences could receive. The raw version, the 3 a.m. version, the version that was just a voice and a piano and an unresolved note circling back to itself, existed only in the memories of the people who had been there. And Sly Stone was, as far as anyone knew, the only person outside the room who had heard it at all. He never talked about it. Not in the interviews he gave in the years that followed, not in the retrospective conversations about his career that became more frequent as the distance from his peak years grew. Not when journalists asked him about his relationship with Marvin, not when they asked about his influences, not when they asked about the moments in his career that had changed the way he thought about music. He would answer those questions, usually briefly, usually redirecting towards something more comfortable. The night in the corridor at Hitsville West was not a story he told. What he had heard was not his to tell. That was part of it. The other part was harder to articulate, though he understood it clearly enough in the wordless way you understand things that resist language. What he had heard through that door was something that belonged entirely to Marvin, not as intellectual property, not as artistic material, but as a human being in a private moment of reckoning with his own interior life. To speak about it would have been to take something that was not offered. To make a story out of it would have been to reduce it to the dimensions a story could hold, and the thing itself was larger than that. There was also this. Speaking about it would have required Sly to account for what it had done to him, and that accounting would have required admitting things about himself that he had spent years not admitting, that the music he'd made at his best had come from a similar place, from the same raw, unmediated contact with feeling that Marvin was maintaining alone in that room, and that somewhere along the way, he had lost the direct line to that place, had replaced it with something louder and more manageable, had confused the performance of feeling with the feeling itself. He had heard through a door he never opened, a man who had not made that trade, and the sound of it had stayed with him in the way that certain things stay with you, not as a memory you return to deliberately, but as a presence that reshapes the silence around it. The unresolved note on the piano, the voice that was not performing anything for anyone, the particular quality of a human being who is alone with the truth of his own experience and has, for the moment, stopped trying to make it into something other than what it is. Years later, when people asked Sly Stone about the artists who had mattered to him, and they asked this often, in the way that interviewers always return to the question of influence as though it explains more than it does, he would mention names. He would speak about the people who had shaped his musical thinking, the records that had moved him, the moments in performance he had witnessed and carried forward. He spoke about these things with the easy fluency of a man who has told the stories enough times that they have become smooth and comfortable in the telling. He never mentioned Marvin, not in those conversations, not in the context of influence or admiration or the music that had changed something in him. He left that space empty and moved on to the next question. And the interviewers, not knowing what was in the space, did not press. The corridor at Hitsville West, the line of light under the door, the voice finding its way around something it could not name, the unresolved note circling back to itself over and over, never landing. Some things you carry not because you've chosen to, but because they've chosen you. Because they attach themselves to something in you that recognized them before you had the language to describe what was being recognized. Sly Stone had walked down that hallway at 3 in the morning and heard something that he would spend the rest of his life not talking about. And the not talking was not silence. It was the shape that the experience had taken inside him. The form that something takes when you understand, without being able to say so, that it was real and that it cost you something you hadn't agreed to spend. Marvin Gaye died in April 1984, one day before his 45th birthday. Sly Stone was not at the funeral. He heard about the death the way most people heard about it, through the ordinary channels by which news travels, arriving in the middle of whatever else the day contained, and then settling into a different category from the rest of the day. He did not speak publicly about it. He was by then moving through his own diminished orbit, his own version of the slow erosion that had been taking him apart for years.